Okay, so Hannah, could you please give us an update on the main changes that came into force on the 21st of May?
Yes. So a lot of it's still the same, and a lot of the principles are still the same, but there have been a few technical changes. So one of the changes, and we'll start with the negative, in my opinion. The negative change is that they have now limited the size of dwellings to a maximum of 150 square metres per dwelling.
Right.
There used to be, under the old rules, large dwellings and small dwellings, and you could have much bigger dwellings.
Yeah.
But now, under the new Class Q rules they came into effect last year, but there was this transitional period, and now from May 2025, just gone, we are only into the new rules. And under the new rules, the building, the converted house maximum of 150 square metres, which is still a 3 or 4 bedroom house.
I was going to ask that.
Yeah.
What does that in my brain?
Yeah.
What would that equate to?
It's a goodish 3, smaller 4 bedroom house. And that when I'm talking about 150 square metres, what we're talking about is both floors if there are 2 floors. So it would effectively be 75 ground floor, 75 first floor. So we're not talking footprint, we're talking habitable floor space. So 150 square metres. So 4 bedroom house, but under the old rules we could have up to like 450 square metres or something. So it's significantly reduced it. So that's the negative, in my opinion. Some people won't mind that too much, but it does, I think, limit some of the bigger dwellings. But it is what it is. So 150 square metres. However, on the good side, we can have an increased number of dwellings per agricultural unit or per holding now.
Right.
And that number is now 10. So before there was a limit of 5. So that's gone up to 10. But you can't have any more than 1,000. You can't convert any more than 1,000 square metres of floor space of agricultural building to residential.
Right.
So you've got various permutations in there. So you could have 10 times 100 square metres to use your 1,000, or if you divide 1,000 by the maximum 150, it's about 5.5 or 6.5. I can't remember.
Yeah.
But 5 or 6 dwellings would be your max if you wanted to go to the bigger 150 square metres. So, or you can actually have a bit of a combination. So you could do 4 times 150, which is 600, and then 4 times 100 or something like that.
So a few 2 beds, some 3 beds.
That's right. Yeah. So and a lot of that will derive how that develops will derive on the original size and shape of the agricultural building, because not forgetting, going back to our other video, that we've got to get natural light into all the windows. If you've just got this really big fat square, 1,000 square metre building, it's going to be really hard to get light into the middle. So that's going to dictate as to how many dwellings you can do and so on. So limited to 150, but we can have up to 10. Total on per holding is 1,000 square metres. One of the other good positives that's come out of the changes is that they will now, we haven't done it very often yet actually, but they will now allow an extension of 4 metres to the rear of a building. That in itself has some questions over it, which will come out, I'm sure, over the next few months. What is the rear of a building? Obviously, some are really obvious. If you've got to drive up to the front of it, the rear is at the back. But if you've got a grain shed that's literally in the middle of a farmyard or something, what constitutes the rear of a building? So there are going to be some question marks over the rear. But in theory, if that's obvious, you can have a 4 metre extension, but that 4 metre extension still comes within your 150 square metre limit.
Okay.
So you'd only put the extension on if you haven't utilised your 150 square metres. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but it's quite complicated, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is where I guess working with Nadia really helps, because she can design those and work it out and the best use of space.
And it's especially complicated because in a lot of instances, and this happens probably on 90% of our Class Qs, is that you don't just have a building that's 150 square metres or 300 or 450. So what you have to do is you have to work out your ground floor, then you're going to add a bit of first floor, and then going back to the point about windows and And then we've also got to think about parking and garden and everything else and all the permutations that go around with that. So it does take some design and some working out.
And you want to make the best use of your space, ultimately.
Yes, and ultimately it actually comes back to, and this is where a good planning consultant would be worth their weight, is that you've got to work out what the objectives are.
Yes.
Because there's no point in just charging into, I can get you 5 at this, or I can get you 10 at this, or whatever. Whereas, of course, if that's not what anybody wants or needs.
Yeah.
And so you've also got to think about it with a developer's hat on as well. So if your class Q is for granny or son or you to live in, there's a design element, and that's going to have to be what you want it to be as a house. And so there's a toing and froing there. What do you want this to look like as a house? But if you are doing this with a view to selling the site, to get a capital, a cash amount to sell the site,
it's totally different.
And it's about optimizing the value of the site then. So actually, you can't just think of it with a planning hat on at that point. What you've got to think about is what actually you've got to go right to the end. How will the people that are going to live in this want to live in this? How is it going to be laid out? How is it going to relate the context to each other? Then you work back to because you've got to get that right. Then a developer is only going to pay the most amount of money for the plot if it works as a development site. So as you know, we do some development work ourselves, and so I think actually because we do that going into somewhere like we go in and look, and if that is the client's objectives, it's about not just thinking what can we get planning for, it's about thinking how do we maximise the value of this site. So we've got to think with that developer hat on as well, and all of those things come back round in a full circle. So that's where you have to start, really.
Okay, great. Is that all of the...
So there is one more thing that has changed, which is, so we talked earlier about the transition period. So the new rules came in May 2024. There was a transition period of 12 months. And now the old rules are out. We're purely into the new rules as of May 25. And one of the other things under those new rules is that it will have brought in a scope of new agricultural buildings. So this is a little bit complicated, and perhaps maybe rather than going into it in too much detail, we'll just suggest that people phone us if they want any advice on this specifically. But broadly, if the agricultural building was there and is structurally sound and meets all the other criteria, if that was there in July 2023, then it may now be suitable and eligible for Class Q. Before that, it had to be there in 2013, so it's effectively reset the date. So that if the building was there, but the building could not have been put up using agricultural permitted development, it needed to have been a full application. But if it was put up with a full application and was erected and in situ before July 2023, it may now be eligible for Class Q. So even a building that's now less than 2 years old could now be eligible for Class Q. So that brings in a bigger scope, which previously weren't eligible. And the last thing to say, and this is where it does get a little bit confusing, is that buildings that have been severed from an agricultural unit, and so there used to be this pure test in the old rules that the building must be an agricultural building on an agricultural holding, whereas now it's a little bit more vague than that. So if you have an agricultural building that is on an agricultural holding, that's fine, we don't have to think about it anymore. But there are going to be some situations where, let's say, a building was sold off separately from an agricultural unit. Before, that wouldn't have been eligible, it may now be. And similarly, if the building is on an agricultural unit, but since that date has been used for a different use, for example, had horses in it or has been used as a workshop or something, that may now be eligible as well. So before it had...
Sorry about the tractors.
So before, it had to purely be agricultural building, agricultural holding. But since July 23, there is now scope that it doesn't have to be on a unit and may no longer have to be an agricultural building. But it's a bit complicated.
Right.
So give us a ring.
So it's really opening up the opportunities
more
to
buildings.
more people.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. Brilliant.